my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the Edgar Rice Burroughs show. It's the Edgar Rice Burroughs show once again. And today we're going to be talking about Barsoom. Barsoom. That's the Martians' name for Mars. Remember that if you ever go there. So the Martians' name for Mars is Barsoom. So it's called the Barsoom series, also called the Mars series, also known as the John Carter of Mars series. A series of books by Edgar Rice Burroughs, best known, of course, as the creator of Tarzan. But I think, of course, Tarzan is much more popular and well known, but I think the Mars series, or the Barsoom series, is every bit as important as the Tarzan series is. It has been so incredibly influential in science fiction and fantasy. I mean, its influence is huge. It's influenced everything from Dune to Star Wars to, it was, Flash Gordon wouldn't exist at all without John Carter. So, pretty heavy influence, this series. And the first book in the series is A Princess of Mars. I had heard about this series. I read about it in a book that I found in the San Leandro Public Library when I was a kid. And that book had a few paragraphs where it was describing this series of books by Edgar Rice Burroughs and talking about how important and influential it was. And it just sounded incredible. It just sounded like, man, that sounds wonderful. I got to find these books. And fortunately, these books were pretty easy to find back in the 1980s. In fact, in paperback, the Mars series, all of the Mars books, I think almost all of the Edgar Rice Burroughs series of books, they were all available new back when I was a teenager and when I was looking for these. Not the case anymore. Now, to find all of Edgar Rice Burroughs series of books, you pretty much have to go on the eBay or maybe find some print-on-demand copies. Most of them, if not all of them, are available as ebooks too. But this I found as a used copy in a used bookstore. This is the book club edition with the fantastic Frank Frazetta cover. Just an incredible cover that perfectly captures this book and the kind of romantic adventure you will find in it. This story where ex-Confederate soldier John Carter is mystically, it seems to be mystic anyway, transported to the planet Mars, where he has a series of adventures. He encounters the ferocious green Martians. The green Martians are really tall. They're like 12 to 15 feet tall with two sets of arms, big tusks. There's one of them now. He's kind of dead because John Carter killed him. But he encounters the green Martians, the Tharks, where he meets his good friend Tars Tarkas, who captures him, but eventually him and Tars Tarkas become friends. It's a great science fiction fantasy adventure story. A lot of fun. Originally published in the All Story magazine, if I'm remembering right, under the title Under the Moons of Mars in 1912. So this is a story that is over 100 years old. I've talked about the Mars books before and Edgar Rice Burroughs books before. I have mentioned that they are very much products of their time, and you will find, some attitudes in here in Edgar Rice Burroughs books that seem like they were written by a guy 100 years ago. That's something, you always have to keep in mind. But in some ways, Edgar Rice Burroughs was very forward-thinking socially. And you'll see a lot of that in the Mars series, actually. And there's John Carter and there's Dejah Thoris, the Princess of Mars, who's a great character. One thing about Edgar Rice Burroughs is he knew how to write really interesting, strong female characters. They are genuinely strong female characters. And John Carter is just the ultimate hero. This was Edgar Rice Burroughs' first book. So it wasn't his best book, as good as it is. And it's a really good book. He did learn a lot while writing this. In the later books in the series and in later Edgar Rice Burroughs books, he got his sense of pacing down really well. He was always good at action, and he's good at action in this book. But you'll notice right away, if you just follow this one with the second book, that he gets a lot better as far as pacing is concerned in the second book. John Carter is not quite as invincible in the second and third books as he is in the first book. John Carter is from Earth, so when he goes to Mars, with its lesser gravity, he has super strength, basically. And, he could basically punch a green Martian in the face and kill him, because he's got super strength. And he can jump super high, because, he's super powerful. And it's interesting. And so John Carter was probably one character who influenced the creation of Superman and other superheroes. This book influenced all kinds of things. This series did. And this was fantastic. A Princess of Mars, the first book in the series. This was the one that I read with this fantastic Frank Frazetta cover. But let's take a look at some other covers for this first book. This is from the Library of America, and this reproduces the original cover art. And the artist in this, I'm forgetting, so let me look it up. The artist here, the illustrations are done by Frank E. Schoonover. Frank E. Schoonover. And he did that cover as well, I believe. And this is just so cool, this original illustration of John Carter. And this book is full of other illustrations, and the back cover has one of them. John Carter, and there's Dejah Thoris, the Princess of Mars. They wear a lot more clothes on the cover and the illustrations than they do in the actual book. On Mars, nobody wears clothes. Clothes are unknown. They're a weird thing that us human beings do. On Mars, you'll have jewelry and things if you're a lady, or you'll have a harness where you can, like a leather harness where you can hang your weapons. And one interesting thing about Mars is the warriors on Mars use mostly swords. They are outfitted usually with a long sword, a short sword, but they also have firearms. They have rifles and pistols, but they don't use those as much as they use the swords. And it's interesting. Also, the technology on Mars is interesting. So the technology, in some ways, they're very far advanced. They have airships that fly around. They've got all kinds of interesting technology that shows up during the series. But in other ways, it's a very barbaric culture. And we've got a planet that's basically dying. And there are a bunch of dead cities scattered all across Mars. And these are cities that were built by ancient Martians. But now everybody's struggling to survive. And Mars doesn't even have its own atmosphere anymore, unless, at least it wouldn't without these atmosphere factories that were created by the Red Martians. Now, the Red Martians, Dejah Thoris is a Red Martian, they are Martians that look just like people on Earth, except they're red. Other than that, they look just like Earth people. Oh, except for, they lay eggs. They lay eggs. I know it's weird, Roger. They lay eggs. And then the eggs grow. And it's a whole thing. You got to read the books. Anyway, the Red Martians, they have a pretty high level of technology. And so they've created these atmosphere factories that they have to keep running all the time. And if an atmosphere factory breaks down, everybody on the planet can die. It's an interesting thing. So, yeah, A Princess of Mars. There is the original cover. I've got some other covers. This is one of the early Ballantine editions of A Princess of Mars. I like this series of books with these covers. They're pretty good. Let's see if I could find the artist for this. Do they have the cover artist here? Do you not have the cover artist listed? They don't seem to in this edition, which is unfortunate. Somebody will let me know. Somebody will let me know who did the cover for this, but it's fantastic. And then we've got the Michael Whelan cover. And this is the cover that probably most people are familiar with who are familiar with this book. This is from a series of paperbacks where all of the covers were done by Michael Whelan. Wonderful fantasy and science fiction artist. And this could be, next to that Frank Frazetta cover, this could be the greatest cover to this book. It does have a wraparound cover, but you can't see the Martians in this edition because of that. But it's a beautiful cover. Just gorgeous. So that's the first book. And this book, A Princess of Mars, ends on a cliffhanger. So John Carter, he goes to Mars, and in the first 3 books, which form a trilogy, John Carter, he starts off with nothing. He shows up naked, doesn't know anything about Mars. But by the 3rd book, he has reached a very high position in Red Martian society. Now, this is the 2nd book. This is The Gods of Mars. Does this one tell me who did the cover? Bob Abbott. And I think he did the cover for that first one I showed you as well. Although I could be wrong. Am I right or am I wrong? Is this the same series? Yeah, I think Abbott probably did the first cover as well. But this is an interesting cover, although Gods of Mars in this series of books, I don't know what this is referring to, because in this, John Carter seems to be floating in the upper atmosphere of Mars next to, I'm assuming that's a flyer, and I'm not sure where this scene happens in the book. I don't think it does. But it's an interesting cover, certainly, and a great depiction of John Carter. But a better cover to Gods of Mars is the Michael Whelan cover. There's John Carter with Tars Tarkas, and you get a better look at a green Martian there. Every artist, of course, is going to do their own versions of the green Martians, but that's a really pretty great one. And this is a scene directly from the book where John Carter and Tars Tarkas fight the Plant Men. They're fighting the Plant Men. And Gods of Mars is my personal favorite out of all of the Mars books. I think this is one of the best books that Edgar Rice Burroughs ever wrote. Certainly, in many ways, far superior to A Princess of Mars, as far as pacing and probably everything else. This is a wonderful book. Really interesting. A lot of fun. The Gods of Mars. Then we return to Mars. This is the final book of the original John Carter trilogy. This is The Warlord of Mars. And indeed, John Carter in this book becomes the Warlord of Mars, which is actually a title that is given to John Carter. But great picture of John Carter. I'm assuming that's Bob Abbott again. This edition doesn't tell me who the cover artist is. That drives me crazy when books don't give the cover artist. Oh well, I'm pretty sure it is. It's from the same series of books. And an excellent cover. I actually prefer it in this one to the Michael Whelan cover, although this one has Woola on it. Now, Woola is one of the greatest characters from the Mars series. Woola is a Martian dog. He's a Martian dog. He was originally property of the Green Martians who captured John Carter, and Woola was supposed to look after John Carter and make sure John Carter didn't escape. But they soon became fast friends. They became great friends, John Carter and Woola. Because one cool thing about John Carter is John Carter loves animals, which is something that comes right from Edgar Rice Burroughs. Edgar Rice Burroughs loved animals as well. And Edgar Rice Burroughs found in his life, he was in the cavalry, and he found in his time working with horses that if you were kind with horses, you can get him to work with you much easier. And he always loved animals. He loved dogs, loved horses, and he gave those qualities to John Carter. So, yeah, his time as a cavalry officer, came in handy when he was writing John Carter. So, that's the first 3 books. And then that forms a trilogy. And they've been published as a trilogy a few times. This is my favorite edition of just all 3 books in one book, the first 3 Martian books. This was from the very short-lived Library of Wonder, which was published by Fall River for Barnes & Noble. They only made 2 volumes of the Library of Wonder. So the Library of Wonders, I believe they only made this one and a Jules Verne volume. They might have made more, but I've never seen them. But this volume is just incredible, just because of the illustrations. The illustrations are fantastic. They're just great. All 3 books illustrated by Thomas Yeats, and he just does a magnificent job. Let me find some illustrations. Of course, now that I'm looking for them, they'll be harder to find. There's one of John Carter and Dejah Thoris. That's pretty great right there. We've got the Red Martians, and we've got the airships up above there. And all 3 books are illustrated. There's John Carter battling some white apes. I mean, the illustrations in this are just magnificent. Yeats does such a wonderful job. There's some flyers which are about to crash, one of them at least. This is fantastic. If you could find this on eBay, it's well worth picking up because it's a lovely book with fantastic illustrations. My favorite way to read the trilogy, I think. But moving on, that was the first 3 books. And then we moved on to some different characters. Edgar Rice Burroughs was done with his main character for a while. And in the next book, the 4th book, he concentrated on John Carter's son, Carthoris, which is a combination of Carter and Dejah Thoris's name. So John Carter, Dejah Thoris, Carthoris. And that was Thuvia, A Maid of Mars, is the 4th book. And this is probably one of my favorite covers of this book. This is one of the original Ace editions. Ace did some Mars books. They didn't publish all the Mars books for some reason. There was, for some reason, never an Ace edition of A Princess of Mars. I don't think they did any of the original 3 Mars books, which is odd. They started with Thuvia, the 4th book, which, like I said, Carthoris, John Carter's son, was the main character in this book, along with Thuvia, another character from the original trilogy. And this is a magnificent Roy Krinkle cover for the Ace edition. I have a few editions of Thuvia. We've got Thuvia here in this edition with her with a banth. A banth is a Martian lion, and Thuvia has the power to control the banths. And it's not telling me who the cover artist is in this one either. Oh well. It will remain a mystery. But that's a pretty cool cover. This is a British edition. I think this is Sphere. Isn't this Sphere Books? Let me take a look. No, this is New English Library. This is New English Library. And it's not telling me who the cover artist is either. So annoying. But this is a New English Library edition of Thuvia. Great cover. Probably my favorite cover might be this one, the Michael Whalen. Just such a great version of the Banth, the Martian lion. Then we move on to a Chessmen of Mars. A Chessmen of Mars, where Gahan of Gothal, a Martian, is the main hero of this story. And it's awesome. And this is a great crinkle cover of the Chessmen of Mars. There is a Martian game of chess called Jetton. And here we see, human beings being used as actual pieces. And they have to fight it out on a gigantic chessboard. It's pretty cool. This is actually a really, really good book. This is one of my favorites from the Mars series. And I have I have two other editions of that. This is another edition of Chessmen. And I have this edition of Chessmen. And these are some creepy creatures that you'll find in Chessmen of Mars. You will have these hideous crab-like creatures and bodies without heads. And they crawl on the bodies and they can use the bodies. So bodies are basically disposable for the crab creatures. It's a weird thing that happens on Mars. Chessmen, it's awesome. Following that, we have the Mastermind of Mars. And in this, a different character from Earth, Ulysses Paxton, is mystically transported to Mars. He is a soldier during the First World War and is horribly mangled by a bomb. And he is, at that moment, as he's dying on the battlefield, he's transported to the planet Mars, where he shows up, in perfect shape. Now, the way he's transported to Mars, we never really learn this. It's a mystery. This is a great Roy Crinkle cover of The Mastermind of Mars. It's fantastic. This is an ace edition of this book. This is my other paperback copy, where we have a white ape. This is another really good one. All the Mars books are pretty darn good. Then we have The Fighting Man of Mars, where we move on to a different hero, Hadron of Hastor. One of John Carter's warriors is the main hero of this story. Another great Roy Crinkle cover from an old Ace edition. And in this Ballantine Books edition, we just get some flyers. We get some of the flyers, the air flyers. And that's, if you look really close, you can see the Martian warriors fighting on the flyers. So it's actually a really cool cover. Again, Michael Whelan brings in the best cover, I think, with A Fighting Man of Mars. This one is just great. Great cover for Michael Whelan for Fighting Man. Then John Carter returns as the main character in a book. So John Carter returns as the main character in Swords of Mars. This, for some reason, is the only edition of Swords of Mars that I have. I don't know why, but this is the only one I've got. There's John Carter flying in his flyer there. Then we move on to Book 9, Synthetic Men of Mars. Synthetic Men of Mars. That's a pretty cool cover. Where a guy's fighting the synthetic men. Then we have the Synthetic Men of Mars here in another edition. Those are the only two volumes I have of the Synthetic Men. And then we get to the 10th volume, Lana of Gathal. Lana of Gathal. In this one, we have 4 different novelettes that are put together to make one novel. And by this time, when was this originally published? Was this the 1940s? Yeah. This was, the book publication was the 1940s. And at this point, by the late 30s and the early 40s, pulp magazines were taking novelettes and publishing them as complete novels. They weren't, they were novelettes, but that's how they touted them in the pages of the pulp magazines. And so this is 4 of those novelettes that are connected and form one longer story called Lana of Gathal. So it's a 4-part novel. And it's pretty darn good. Again, John Carter is the hero in this one. There's the great Michael Whelan cover of Lana of Gathal. Now, originally, this was the last book in the paperback series of books. But there was one more, there was one more novelette that was published in a pulp magazine that was clearly supposed to be the first part of a multi-part story, just like Land of Cathal was. But Edgar Rice Burroughs passed away before he could finish that. So this volume has that story, the last John Carter story, called The Skeleton Men of Jupiter, where John Carter, goes and meets the skeleton men of Jupiter. Again, it was supposed to be the first part of a longer story. We only got that novelette, though. But also in this book, we have a story called, where is it? John Carter and the Giant of Mars. That's the story that opens this book. And those two stories make up the last book, John Carter of Mars, the 11th book. Now, you'll notice in that book, when you read it, John Carter and the Giant of Mars, that it doesn't read at all like a John Carter story or like an Edgar Rice Burroughs story. It doesn't read like an Edgar Rice Burroughs story at all. The pacing's different. The descriptions are different. It was clearly written by somebody other than Edgar Rice Burroughs. And this was a mystery for a while. Well, who wrote this thing? Well, it turns out that Edgar Rice Burroughs' son wrote this book. Let's see if they identify who wrote it in this. I can't remember if they did. Okay, John Coleman Burroughs. John Coleman Burroughs wrote that story. He wrote the story, John Carter and the Giant of Mars. Edgar Rice Burroughs' son wrote the story. Apparently, Edgar Rice Burroughs was involved in the story in some way, shape, or form. Whether he came up with the plot, I don't know. But he clearly didn't write the story. But he did write the other story in this volume, Skeleton Men of Jupiter. So when you read that, you're reading the very last John Carter story, which unfortunately sort of ends on a cliffhanger. Clearly the story is not finished and never was finished by Edgar Rice Burroughs anyway. So yeah, there you go. One more thing I want to show you is this book. This is A Guide to Barsoom by John Flint Roy. One of the greatest things about the Mars series by Edgar Rice Burroughs is the world building. I mean, Edgar Rice Burroughs created this whole world full of different cities and monsters and creatures and technology and all this other stuff. And this is really handy to have. My copy is not in the best shape. This, by the way, is probably the only time I've seen Boris Vallejo do a John Carter cover. So there you go, Boris Vallejo doing John Carter. This book is really pretty cool. It has all kinds of stuff in it. You have, well, let me look here at the table of contents if it has one. Well, it doesn't. It has the brief history of Barsoom. It has maps. It has a glossary of terms and creatures and places. Lots of really cool illustrations. Publication dates for all of the original pulp versions of the stories and the first book publications of the stories. So it's full of all kinds of cool stuff. I think it's probably easy to find. Probably easy to find this on eBay. I don't know how expensive it is. I bought this a long, long time ago. But it's really cool if you're interested in background information on the Mars series. It's a fun thing to have lying around while you're reading these books. Man, I've gone on for a long time about this series, and I could probably go on for a lot longer. But I will shut up now, and I will catch you next time.